All righty, let's get this thing going, shall we? My name is Paul Roberts. I'm the cyber content lead here at ReversingLabs. Really happy to be here today to talk about, I think, what's a super important and relevant topic for anybody out there either making software, writing software, releasing it, or consuming it. This is both sides. So we've got a great conversation for you today with two experts in the subject, folks who really have lived this in their own professional lives. First, let me introduce Chris Hughes, who's the president at Acquia and CSO at Endor Labs. Chris, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's great to have you. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself, Chris.
Yeah, definitely. So, just a little bit under 2 decades of cyber experience. Got my start in the U.S. Air Force, active duty in the military, and then, was a federal civilian with a couple of different agencies, once with the Navy doing cloud and DevSecOps, and then also with an organization known as the General Services Administration that runs the FedRAMP program, doing all the reviews of cloud services for the federal market, and have spent some time in the private sector, working with different Department of Defense software factories and cloud environments like that. And then ultimately founded Acquia here with some partners where we're a cybersecurity services startup, focused on public and private sector and in areas like AppSec and software supply chain, DevSecOps, and those kind of things. You're on mute, Paul.
I'll get the hang of this one of these days, guys. Joining Chris, we have Sasha Yeller, who is my colleague here at ReversingLabs, where he is our Chief Trust Officer. Sasha, welcome, and tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Paul, and happy to do that. So Sasha Yeller, I've been with ReversingLabs for a few months now. Prior to that, I spent some time at Salesforce as the SVP of security there. And then prior to that, I spent about 20 years in the energy sector working at ExxonMobil.
Just a little bit about ReversingLabs. We are a leader both in threat intelligence as well as software supply chain security. So we are on a mission to provide comprehensive supply chain security, malware analysis, really kind of combining those two in a way that I think is very relevant to the way that threats and attacks are playing out right now in organizations. We're going to talk today about the sort of the way that threat actors, malware authors are turning to particularly open source platforms as a avenue into security conscious organizations, and that's really in the wheelhouse for ReversingLabs. Got a long history as an expert in malware analysis, and have also been involved in recent years in helping companies address software supply chain risks. So just to know about us, check us out at reversinglabs.com. We met our speakers. And then the conversation today, pretty straightforward. We're going to start off just with just kind of framing up what is secure by design. And then we're going to get into, as a development organization, as well as a software consumer, what do you need to know about secure by design principles, and how can you kind of operationalize those both as a software producer and as a software consumer? Chris and Sasha are going to be super helpful in that. The background here, we all know it. Supply chain attacks and threats are on the rise. We've heard a lot about MOVEit. I actually just wrote a blog post today about my own impact. I've been impacted by the MOVEit vulnerability. I'm sure most of you have as well. 2,500 organizations, I think, to date, $9 billion in damage. 3CX, another recent supply chain attack, a little bit more limited in scope. And then Kaseya, Toyota, SolarWinds, and on and on and on. And as we're going to talk about, big surge in malicious activity on open source platforms. And we've seen a jump in malicious packages and other things on platforms like NPM, Python Package Index. The stakes are rising for organizations, right? We heard the SEC file charges against SolarWinds and its CISO for not properly disclosing cybersecurity risks that they, at least the SEC alleged they were aware of. And we're seeing a lot more, at least words and guidance from the federal government, raising the bar and expectations, at least for federal contractors, around software security. So that's all kind of the background on this. And one other thing we're going to be talking about is just the recent CISA Secure by Design publication that was updated in October, came out originally in April. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So with that in mind, I think, as I said, probably a good place to start. And Chris, I'm going to toss this one into you. Secure by Design, what does that mean to you practically, as if you're advising a company that's making software, that's producing software? What does it really entail?
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word practically. So I will lead in with the definition, since you cited the CISA, publication. I'll define what they define it as, and then go from there. They kind of define it as secure by design means that technology products are built in a way that reasonably protects against malicious cyber actors successfully gaining access to devices, data, and connected infrastructure. I think when you talk about the practicality part, it talks about that reasonable protection, doing things that we all know we should be doing from a best practice perspective in terms of producing secure code, following secure software development practices, producing products that are kind of secure and secure by default, secure out of the box. Customers don't have to go in, and CISA has a big advocate in the document of doing producing what they call loosening guides versus hardening guides. We all get a product, we all get software. We're used to having going in there and harden it, right? Put secure configurations in place, lock things down. And they're trying to flip that paradigm and have folks instead produce products and software that you receive that's default configuration securely, versus the opposite, where you have to go in and the customer kind of navigate that and try to understand how to make it secure. Now, so following those best practices, and around secure software development, producing products that put customers in a position to be successful out the gate rather than have to navigate and kind of lock something down on their own, is kind of where we're headed with the industry.
Sasha, you've worked within both software companies that just consumers of software. That's every company, but also software producers. What does Secure by Design mean to you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I get to look at this from a lens of having worked for almost 20 years at probably one of the world's largest software consumers. And then the world's largest software, enterprise software producer. And it's very interesting that, I'll just say what's old is new again, right? We hear about the guidance on Secure by Design, but, for those that are old enough to either remember or nerds about it like I am, if you think back to 1975 and Seltzer and Schroeder, we got some really good guidance then that if we just would have actually implemented it, in our systems and our software, it would have served us very well. And of course, since 1975, it has been, let's say, generally ignored. And now it's incumbent upon us and the rest of the industry to make sure that this latest guidance is not like Seltzer and Schroeder's becomes something, that we look back in history, but something that actually gets codified and used. So, what I would look forward to, and I love the example about, loosening guides, is I spent 20 years talking to really giant vendors, like Fortune 25 vendors who make software that run large enterprises, about why it is that they, give me a product that by default does everything in a way that I can't and shouldn't use in my enterprise. And it's incumbent upon me and, kind of hub and spoke, right? They sell it to the spokes, and it's incumbent upon every spoke that they sell to have their own cyber experts to know how to lock these things down. And it's buried, on page 398 of some guide that some web admin portal running in the high 50, 60,000 port range that's completely open, but has the ability to shut down the service, that should really have some kind of a credential put behind it. Don't make me hunt for that. Deliver it to me in a state that's secure by default or secure from the, first minute, and then let me open things up as I feel comfortable. So, I'm excited where the industry is going. I'm excited about the potential for software to finally be shipped to customers in a kind of safe state by default, and then allow every customer, based on their own expertise and level of comfort, to kind of loosen the reins on that a little bit. It's way overdue, and I just hope that with this latest guidance, we all adopt that and take it seriously, and not look back on something like the 75 Seltzer and Schroeder work, and now it's just kind of become a cute part of history, and it could have been a much more powerful mechanism.
Chris, in your experience, because you've done a lot of work with with other companies. How likely is it, if you're a development organization today, that, or you're a developer working within a software maker today, that your organization is really following secure by design principles in the way that they are building their application or whatever it is?
I think something Sasha just said is really important. He said he hopes that we see the industry move this direction. I think all of us as security practitioners hope we see the industry move this direction. But the CISA guidance, for example, it's not a requirement. It uses the word should tens of times. You should do this. Yep. You should, and the reality is, like, vendors are not necessarily required to do these things. And when you're, the incentive structure in place is speed to market, delivering new features out of the backlog. People are kind of incentivized to push more code, push more features, respond to customer requests. Security tends to fall to the back burner in that paradigm. And that's why we have kind of what many consider a market failure in cybersecurity. So I think, part of this push here that CISA is trying to push for, and they kind of emphasize this, is starting to try to get consumers to be a little bit more aware and demand, secure products by configuration, by design, and push the onus onto software suppliers who are in a good position to do something about this. This was also emphasized in the National Cyber Strategy. And it's been spoken about by folks like Jen Easterly, is kind of putting that onus for secure products and software and mitigating vulnerabilities and risk on the suppliers upstream who are in a position to do it. Like Sasha said, the alternative is the paradigm we have now, where all the spokes off of the hub have to address vulnerabilities and patch and remediate things, rather than being done at the source, the people actually producing these things. But that said, I think until the paradigm shifts to where consumer demand kind of drives it in that direction, and or regulatory ramifications and consequences, which we're starting to see a little bit now around liability and class action lawsuits, drive things in that direction, I think we're kind of on a long journey, basically.
I mean, think about how these changes take root typically. They either are driven because the buyer demands, right? Or things are bad enough where some type of statutory or legislative pressure leads to the you must do it. We're not quite at the you must do it. Although, you referenced some of the stuff around some of the, Executive Order 12048. And that's, good, but it's an executive order, which, for anyone who's a little bit of a student of politics and, legislative motions, that is just as quickly as it came, it could also go, depending on which way kind of the political winds may shift for the next administration. However, as tends to be the case, Europe takes things more seriously, right? If you look in Europe, things like DORA, things like the European Cyber Resilience Act, or ECRA, moving through Parliament, which will require independent testing labs to certify software before it can be sold on the EU territory, or what the FDA has done with medical devices. That is far more serious and far more, I would say, on the requiring side of good software with a full software bill of materials, with characteristics that are well-defined. So to me, there are these movements happening in other areas of the world and in some pockets of the US that are stronger than we highly recommend, right? So that's on the legislative side. On the buyer side, to Chris's point, imagine if kind of a corpus of buyers that represent, a significant portion of the, let's say, Fortune 500 or Global 2500, those who actually buy these products, if they simply started demanding better from these vendors, of course they would do it, because then that finally impacts their revenue and the pocketbook. Today, we just haven't quite seen that materialize yet, but I suspect that's coming as well. And I hope, later in the program, we can also talk about the potential cyber insurance implications of this. Imagine if you're a software producer, and the cyber insurance company comes and says, look, here's the thing, because we've had things like SolarWinds where someone's product has led to risk in someone else's environment, or any of these other 3CX or any of these other examples, from a cyber insurance perspective, unless the software that you are shipping to your customers is shipped in a certain state that is, as hardened as possible and as secure as possible, your premiums are going to go up. So, things that hit the pocketbook, that's what's going to ultimately lead to change.
And then real quick on that note, that's a big emphasis on the enterprise software buyers, who I think can really drive things in the right direction, as he talked about. But there are efforts, like NIST has a cybersecurity labeling program that's starting to get a little traction and get some support from Office of the National Cyber Director and CISA and others. And that, I think, is trying to position, if I go to a restaurant, I can see how they're rated. If I go to, purchase some kind of consumer good, I can see it has an A or a B or an F or whatever, right? Or 3 stars. Try and do something like that for software-driven devices, can kind of position the everyday consumer who's not a cybersecurity expert or software expert by any means, but can quickly make a decision. Hey, that's a C, this is an A, I'm going to buy that. That hits the suppliers in the pocketbook, and that can help drive change too.
I mean, I liken that to shopping for a car, but not being able to see its crash test worthiness, right? You know, if you go and you consider two cars side by side, and one has been crash tested, and some independent organization gave its ratings on it, you know, frontal side, whatever these various rollover, whatever these various things that are, you have some feel of an independent, validated safety, you know, rating. We don't have that for software. If we did, it would be very, very powerful.
And we don't have it for software-driven things either, right? You know, you go to Best Buy and look for webcams, you know, you got two webcams, one that's encrypting traffic and one it isn't. There's no way to tell that, right? And you might be willing to pay $4 or $5 more for the one that encrypts your traffic. But yeah, again, like consumers are not read in on the, you know, even high-level security features of what they're buying, which is a real problem. Okay, so first of all, let me remind our guests, we want to hear your questions. You got two experts on the line, and they're happy to answer your questions for free. So take advantage of that. Use the Q&A feature, and we'll get them. We'll get to them. So you know, as you mentioned, Sasha and Chris, CISA has published some guidelines for secure by design, and you know, what's in those guidelines is some stuff that we've heard a lot of talk about over, you know, the last decade or even 2 decades. You know, static application security testing, you know, SaaS, DAS, software composition analysis, using single sign-on and multi-factor authentication to secure, you know, development environments and applications. You know, vulnerability management. I guess looking at their guidelines, which seems like, yeah, I've read about most of this stuff before. Is there stuff that's missing from that? Or is actually just getting companies to do that basic blocking and tackling, is that going to get us, you know, 90% of the way towards, you know, secure applications that we need to get? Or is there stuff that's, I guess, left out of that CISA guidance, or that maybe we should be emphasizing more now than the traditional stuff?
So I'll just say from my perspective, like obviously no security guidance is going to be perfect, right? And no security implementation is going to eliminate all risk. But I think these are, you know, generally considered best practices that are should be widely adopted and have been proven to mitigate risk if done correctly and institutionalized as part of your organizational processes. And one other thing I want to call out, aside from kind of the tactical recommendations that they make, is they lay out 3 high-level software security product principles, which are take ownership of customer security outcomes, embracing radical transparency and accountability, and building organizational structure and leadership to achieve these goals. And the reason I think that those high-level principles are important is we talked about, you know, taking ownership rather than pushing the onus to downstream customers and consumers. You as a software supplier, you're starting to take some ownership of what are we producing? Is it secure? Are we just pushing, you know, garbage out down to customers that are going to put them at risk? And then also you talked about vulnerability management and disclosure, for example, having that radical transparency, saying, you know what, we did have an incident. Here's what happened. Here's what's been impacted. Here's what we're doing about it, rather than like many of the announcements where it kind of beats around a bush. It's kind of opaque. They don't really disclose that something happened until, you know, weeks or months later, until someone else, a third party, kind of reports it, for example. Just having that transparency with the customers and consumers can go a long way. And then the last piece I think is important is that organizational structure and leadership. It's one thing to say, you know, security is job zero or security is a top priority, but without the right organizational incentives in terms of like rewarding people for doing the right things, rewarding people for taking the time to produce secure products, I think it's going to be unlikely that we see those changes. So those principles can go a long way too.
I think the CISA guidance, Paul, is, you know, really, really good to see, because it puts, you know, an organization very respected for its, you know, guidance in general, in the forefront for recommending things that every security program should include. So absolutely no debate there. And most of what they recommend is stuff that is, let's say, traditional parts of quality AppSec programs that is very hard to argue with. In fact, I don't think anyone would argue with that doing, you know, SAST and DAST and SCA and all these various things is definitely good. I would contend that it's not even close to enough. And let me say a little bit more about why. If you look at, again, some of the examples that we brought up, SolarWinds, 3CX, Kaseya, Circle CI, MoveIt, all the way back to not Petya or further. Not a single component of any of the AppSec programs currently listed in CISA guidance would have prevented any one of those, because you can't SAST Zoom.exe. You can't SAST, 3cx.exe. You can't run those things on someone else's software. You can't, none of those things. DAST will not find malware. DAST will find cross-site scripting in web apps that you've already deployed in some test environment. It will not find malware. It will not find implants, backdoors, tampered software. So it finds certain categories of vulnerabilities, which are absolutely a concern and should be worried about. What's missing, so to keep kind of maybe borrowing the car analogy from, the crash test rating, what's missing is the crash test for the system as a whole. There's nothing that looks at a binary that you receive from a third party, or even that you might produce yourself at the end before you send it to production, and checking for the types of things that have been in these third-party, software supply chain breaches, which is the existence of malware or the fact that it's been backdoored or tampered with. That will not be found by SAST, DAST, SCA, or any existing traditional mechanisms in an AppSec program. That's where I think the CISA guidance, or maybe the next revision or something like that, could go a lot further, because I think they could have addressed the way that these actual companies are being breached.
Yeah. And we've, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Real quick on that. No, I like where Sasha's going with it. Like, these are all granular tactical activities, but they don't get to the kind of comprehensive communication that he's referring to in terms of the overall product or software, not these, kind of granular activities and findings, but the overall system or software that you're consuming and communicating that, in a comprehensive fashion to customers.
And, this isn't just kind of hypotheticals either. I mean, ReversingLabs has written about discovering in NPM R77 rootkit that was masquerading as a legitimate package, using a typo squatting attack, so very similar named, package, straight up malware, on NPM, not even just a downloader. So, these attacks are out there and those risks are real. Totally agree. I mean, one of the things I thought was interesting in this as a guidance was so they had the whole part on kind of as they say, radical transparency, right? Software makers need to be a lot more transparent about, as you said, their risks, vulnerabilities, and so on. One of the recommendations they had was for software makers to provide updates on their alignment or compliance with secure development frameworks to their customers, and I guess to the public, to sort of say, well, here's where we are in our sort of evolution. I love that idea, and I love the idea of radical transparency. It's very hard for me to understand why a software maker would do that now, absent a stick versus a carrot from with the federal government or a regulator and maybe an insurer to make them be transparent like that. But I don't know, maybe, am I missing something, gentlemen?
No, I think it goes back to what Sasha talked about, is like hitting the pocketbook. And you talked about those third parties, whether it's a regulator or an insurance provider or the consumer, until those things start to demand this, security necessarily won't be seen as a competitive differentiator. Once that happens from a consumer or buyer's perspective, then the suppliers are kind of incentivized to lean on that and champion that, that transparency and accountability around producing secure products and software, or, the vice versa. They don't want to not be transparent to the insurer provider to get a proper premium or save money there or avoid regulatory consequences. So I think that those sticks essentially have to be there because, security is often viewed as a cost center still. And people only spend and do as much as they're required to, whether from a buyer and consumer perspective in terms of revenue or, regulatory and insurance purposes.
And look, a lot of times the degree of transparency, so one way to provide the transparency is in a truly comprehensive software bill of materials. That can also be a lot of competitive intelligence. Sometimes what you use, what you package, what components you use, could be a lot of information for your competitors that they could say, aha, that must be how they achieve that speed. They're using that one Ruby library or whatever it is, right? So sometimes it's, look, we just don't want to tell you. We don't want to tell you because this is our secret sauce. Or maybe we don't want to tell you because we charge you a lot of money for something that is otherwise a bunch of open source software stitched together, and maybe if we told you, it might drive down the renewal or something along those lines. So to the point I think made earlier in the webcast, I think it's going to take things that hit the pocketbook. It's either going to be legislation and, requiring transparency, or it's going to be buyers saying, look, the analogy I like to use is if you go to the grocery store and, you are a celiac or some other condition, you really like the fact that you can grab any food off the shelf, right? A box of Cheerios, look at the back and say, okay, this has gluten or whatever it might be. This is not good for my system. Therefore, I'm not going to consume this. And I think that's exactly what buyers are going to start demanding, to say, look, too many things have gone wrong with components that, aren't updated, outdated, or whatever it is. We have decided as a company that this list of things are bad for our system, and we don't want to bring them into our system. I want the nutritional label. Give me the nutritional label for the software you're selling me. I want to know what you want me to bring into my system. I could be allergic to it. My environment could be allergic to that component, meaning I don't want it. I don't want to have to manage it. I don't want to worry about the risk of the maintainers of it. I want to know what you're proposing to put into my environment. I think it's going to take buyer side pressure to really push this over the line.
So go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
On the buyer side pressure, just because I'm heavily involved in the federal space, we are seeing the federal government try to use their massive purchasing power to drive things in this direction. There's been a couple of memos from the Office of Management and Budget 2218 and 2316, where they start pushing that they're going to have, suppliers, software manufacturers self-attest to meeting things like secure software development framework from NIST. They're going to start to have to potentially provide artifacts like an SBOM and provide that transparency and showing what open source software components are in their product, and if they're, doing their due diligence around including, secure libraries and components, for example. And it's not the whole market, but they, spend tens of billions of dollars every year on technologies and services. So it can definitely make an impact of driving that systemic change. And I think that's what we're trying to see. That's what we're seeing the federal government try to do, is use that purchasing power to drive that systemic change.
Sometimes the way this ends up working out for the good of the entire industry is if you think back to like FedRAMP, right? Initially, it was like, well, look, anyone who wants to sell cloud services and things like that to the federal government or certain, organizations within the government must be this, FedRAMP thing. And I used to work for, some of the companies that work to achieve these various, FedRAMP High and IL5 and IL6 and things. And what would happen is, initially there'd be maybe a little bit of friction and tension. Well, this is overkill, this isn't. But once you go through the process, what almost every company I've talked to has done is they've said, okay, look, once we're up to this level and once we put these controls in place, boy, this just feels like the right thing to have been doing all along. And we're just going to apply these controls to the rest of our non-FedRAMP environments as well, maybe except the one that requires, US employees. That's like usually the one that they deviate from for the non-FedRAMP. But the point is, a lot of this stuff that ends up being often required by the federal government is very quickly then adopted as just the right thing to do by the rest of the industry. So I think the government does have actually a big role to play here, because they can push a lot of the largest suppliers. I mean, think about who does business with the federal government, or who does business with someone who does business with the federal government, because that's generally, how far the umbrella goes. Once you get to that second layer, you're pretty much talking about 90% of the, ISV industry that matters. And at that point, it just becomes the we're the only ones not doing these good practices. We should, because it becomes a competitive advantage. So I think the government can actually play a very large positive role here.
Yeah, I know we talked about this. Everyone's kind of a supplier and a consumer. So those large suppliers that he's referring to, they often have tens or hundreds of suppliers of their own that they're going to push those requirements downstream to as well, saying, hey, government's asking us, we need to know from you, what are you putting in, X, Y, and Z. So it's going to have that cascading impact, I think.
So just at a practical level for development organizations, there are some frameworks out there that can provide a kind of scaffolding for building up a secure by design process. NIST has a secure software development framework. OWASP has their SAM framework. Could you just, Chris, maybe just talk a little bit about those and what kind of utility they have for development organizations that are looking to go down this road?
Yeah, I think, one thing anyone who's been in or around government that was refreshing to see is NIST didn't recreate the wheel here. They used what existed already. If you look at this NIST as Secure Software Development Framework, they cross-map that to, things like BSIM, Building Security and Maturity Model, or OWASP-SAM, Software Assurance Maturity Model, for example. They cross-map those practices. And it's practical because it takes you through kind of 4 phases of preparing their organization, producing software, responding to vulnerabilities, and all the things that we're talking about of, running the right kind of scans, using secure coding languages, being transparent around vulnerabilities and having vulnerability disclosure programs in place and communicating with your customers. As this is a great framework for people to use, and they may look at this and say, hey, we are already doing some of these things, maybe not all of them, but we're doing some of them. And they can do kind of a gap analysis of saying, hey, when it comes to responding to vulnerabilities, we are missing these practices. Now let's kind of capture these and burn these down, institutionalize these processes, or implement these tools that we have gaps around, and kind of close up those gaps that exist, and ultimately end up producing more secure software and building more trust with their customer.
Absolutely. And I actually will say we link to the CISA guidelines and guidance in the chat. And I think actually one of the most useful aspects of that is they have a very comprehensive kind of index of all the different publications that CISA and FBI and other government agencies in Europe, UK and EU have put out that you can kind of look at, and they kind of put them all together in one place. So that's something that I think makes that thing worth reading in and of itself.
Sorry, just want to add one thing to
go
what
ahead,
Chris said.
Sasha.
So it's a total yes and. I completely agree with everything you said. The only additional thought I have is, I've seen over the last maybe 5 years, I've seen the quality, or let's say the attestation that you can provide about your AppSec program or quality of your product security program. I've seen that increasingly used as kind of a competitive advantage between software vendors. It is, they've named chief trust officers. They've used, the how many certifications and how many of these standards they comply with as a means of, shortening the sales cycle, as a means of, helping with revenue, because for some customers it's important. So like I've seen kind of security switch in a really positive way from, what may have been in the old school kind of cost center. It's just, this thing that slows things down. And I've seen it actually used as a powerful, amplifier to sales and revenue and your ability to compete.
So we have a question from Anonymous. Funny, they were in my last webinar as well. Besides the buyer side pressure to impact change in enterprise organizations, any thoughts on the real executive legal action, jail time, et cetera, for companies that don't take proactive actions to mitigate their company's software risk management profile? I think one of the things this brings up is the recent SEC actions with regard to SolarWinds. But gentlemen, I throw that one to you.
I'll let Sasha go first. I've been talking a lot first, so go ahead.
Sure, no problem. So, I think, first of all, thank you for bringing up the point. If you hadn't, I think, I would have found an opportunity to bring this up as well later, because it's in addition to legislation and it's in addition to buyer side pressure. I think now there's an entirely different set of concerns for a board, whether it's they're consuming or they're producing. So, and I guess to emphasize the point that Chris made earlier, even software producers are some of the biggest consumers of the world in the world as well. So now, if you are a CISO, right, compared to, let's say, prior to the SolarWinds Wells notice, there was kind of this like ambiguous, well, is it really a problem? And we haven't really seen anyone get called up for this. But now you're starting to see one extra variable in all of this, not only for the CISO, but for the company itself, which is, boy, are we going to be potentially held criminally or financially liable for this? And, could there theoretically be jail time for executives that were involved in the representation of the security program, or in decisions made, or what risk may have been accepted versus not accepted? All of a sudden, the decisions that the CISO or whoever might be in charge of product security are making in the balance of, is the release date king? Is the risk king? Is our customer's privacy king? What rules in this case? I think the equation just got significantly, altered with what just happened. I think a lot of companies are going to go back and start reviewing the public attestations that they've made about the, security state of their program, about how they've documented their, the level of compliance with something. I've certainly been involved a lot in situations where, let's just say there's kind of a final editorial done by marketing or other organizations that say, well, this wording perhaps sounds better, and it's just more eloquently put if we word it like this. I think that is about to change in favor of wording being a lot like, frankly, what you might have written in an exchange with an auditor, right? Which is, you stick to the pure facts. There are no extra words that don't add any value, you scrutinize placement of comma, like let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma, is a very different sentence. And I think you're going to find a lot of pedantic, very academic approaches to, the output from security teams versus what may have been done before, which is a lot of like, well, let's find a way to cast this in a certain light that does this or that. I think that time is effectively over, specifically because of what Anonymous brings up, which is, we now have, specific fiduciary, potentially criminal, financial, and other liabilities for key leaders.
Yeah, I won't kind of add. I'll add to what he said, but I think everything he said is great and spot on. The one aspect I do like about the question from the audience there is it talks about for executives. We're obviously seeing a lot of action towards the CISO, but anyone who's been in security for some time knows that we're often in a position to kind of advocate for, recommend, suggest, help the organization, help the business make risk-informed decisions, but we often can't make them do something. Often we're advising them. So in addition to, being transparent and ensuring that your public communications are really clean and like you talked about academic, I think it's going to be the case. But there also needs to be kind of an industry recognition that, maybe the CISO has advised and recommended and suggested and begged for some things to be addressed. And maybe they just simply weren't by the business, and it can't only fall on the CISO. It now needs to fall on the business leadership as well.
Right. And just some context around that SEC, my understanding is that was the allegation is that SolarWinds was aware of cyber risks because of internal conversations and so on. But in their disclosures to the SEC, it was more kind of boilerplate language about, software risk, whereas, the SEC is alleging, and again, nothing's been proven yet, but that they had knowledge of actually more specific types of cyber risks that they should have disclosed to the public. I guess one question is the end result of that, though, that companies might just start zipping their lips and in some ways internally saying, we don't want to know about it. If you got a concern, please don't, air it, at least in email or some other, Slack or some way that we could actually be held to account for it. Is that a danger, I guess, going forward?
Yeah, I'll just say from my perspective, I think obviously there may be some of that in terms of not elevating things to visibility if they aren't required to be, but there is language in there around materiality. And if an organization knows of an incident or knows of something that happened that had material impact, they now have to disclose that, right, to the SEC, and it could be disclosed to investors, which obviously is going to get the information out there. And then, that can serve as that competitive differentiator that we talked about. If I'm a leading firm and I want to make sure I'm, putting information out there that inspires trust from consumers and investors, I better have my stuff together internally, or those statements are not going to really build trust and spur investment from investors.
Just one other comment. If we have folks on the call here who are in sort of these, prominent leadership roles, I've worked in organizations in the past that were, honestly, I would say 20 years ahead of some of these concerns around what might come down the pipe from a, risk perspective or legislative perspective. And, what you might want to start considering is things like careful drafting training for your entire workforce, right? As is often said, whatever you've ever written down will only ever be used against you, not for you in a court of law. So, think about how you might word something in an email. You receive some kind of, vulnerability scan output or whatever that says, yeah, we have this, high, whatever SQL injection thing here. What you then do with that and how you comment on that, if you forward that to your team and say, we are so unbelievably, screwed with this is going to lead to this giant breach and whatever, like, you don't know that. Something should be investigated. You may have mitigating controls. Like, just be very careful with what in the moment you choose to write down and say, because it let's just say it needs to be as close to the facts and truth only, and very, very little subjectivity and hyperbole and stuff like that. And that applies to, Slack communications, that applies to text messages, you said, that applies to email. So something around careful drafting are considerations. The other one that I know more and more companies are moving to is things like, look, if I'm considering something like a, benchmarking of my security program versus others, if I'm considering, some sort of a systemic pen test to see how my controls stack up against other things, look, anyone who's, to Chris's point, anyone who's been a practitioner or a CISO knows that there's not a single pen test in the world or scan that you commission that doesn't come back with, pre-written things about like, you should be better at patching, and, you should really consider, these other 7 things that every environment should consider. That now becomes discoverable, right? And any future lawsuit, that is all subject to scoping and discovery. And the fact that someone provided you a canned report that said you should be better at patching, that will be used against you, not for you. So a lot of companies are now switching to, working directly with an outside counsel for those types of things, so that the output of those reports is, privileged, is underprivileged, and it is subject to slightly different discovery rules than if it was, without the consultation of outside counsel. So some of those mechanisms are just, I would say, things to think about in this post SolarWinds Wells Notice world.
So a lot of our conversation so far has been focused on software producers, on development organizations, software publishers. Obviously, there's a huge impact of supply chain risk on software consumers. The MoveIt exploits and attacks is really just brings us to the forefront. I mean, just devastating and incredibly widespread, really trusted application in so many firms. What lessons are there for, as you said, Sasha, the companies that, like the one you worked for, that yes, produce their own software, but they're also relying heavily on other platforms and other companies' software. How should they try and orient themselves around this type of risk? Because a lot of the investments they've made to date are around addressing traditional types of IT risks, right? Malware, malicious email attachments, and denial of service attacks, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting new vectors that every company out there may not be thinking of today because they honestly have other things to worry about. So, one that I actually talked to folks about quite a bit is, pre-COVID, we were all doing a tremendous amount of business over email, right? We were sending each other invoices between, outside firms and inside. We were sending each other files, and most of that was done through email. A lot of companies were on kind of their own place in their own digital transformation journey. Some were early adopters, some were not. But COVID kind of shoved the vast majority of the planet into adopting a lot of new technologies quickly that they would otherwise have been maybe a bit more deliberate and meticulous in understanding the risk of and adopting, and to our earlier point, hardening versus loosening, when they first got. So one thing that's interesting that I've seen as a trend is, everyone had built their version of a secure kind of stack or perimeter for things inbound and outbound over email. But then we all shifted into platforms like Slack and Teams and Zoom, and we use chat there a lot. And whereas we would send each other files through email before, now we're slinging files between entities through Slack Connect or through Teams Federation or Zoom Federation. We're sending files in and out to each other and to other companies over those platforms. And they generally have no protection for any kind of malware that's inbound or outbound. Like, that's an example of a vector that I think, companies who may have had to pretty radically and quickly transform during kind of the COVID years, and honestly went through a tremendous amount of personnel changes and churn through kind of the Great Resignation, like that has probably fallen through the cracks for most companies. They may not be thinking about that as a new vector for, bad things to come in and good things to get out of their company. What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
No, I think you're spot on. It's often joked that COVID did more for digital transformation than any CIO, right? And it did lead to widespread adoption of things like SaaS, like you talked about, Slack and Dropbox and all these communications and collaboration tools, which are great and have, helped us kind of facilitate that geo-distributed, situation of working together. But most people, when it comes to software supply chain security, they're typically looking at things that they're running in their own environment. They took an install, they deployed it in an instance in AWS or whatever, right? They run it on-prem. But the reality is a lot of the software that's now being consumed is over the internet via SaaS, and people don't have good visibility of, what data is in there. Is it sensitive data? Is it proprietary data? Who has access to it? Are we federating the identities to access these apps? How are we kind of managing the security configurations of these things? And all that kind of stuff can lead to essentially, sprawl of these SaaS applications and software that people are consuming over the internet with no real good governance of security of it, and it can lead to a lot of complications and risks for sure.
I think for
And we've
folks out
seen,
there, don't think of SBOM as just something for software you buy that you're going to install in your environment. Think about when is it time, I would argue now, when is it time to start asking your SaaS providers for the ingredient list? Look, you are trusting them to be very, very good stewards and custodians of your data. You want to know what's running on those systems that might heighten or lessen the risk of your data getting out or a breach or a compromise. It's probably time to start asking our SaaS providers for an SBOM for what they run. You want to know the same way.
So let me just remind our guests, we are taking questions, use a QA feature, and Chris, Sasha, and I will be happy to field your question and hopefully get it answered. Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about open source cyber risk because, frankly, it's easy, right? These are open platforms, so you can scrutinize them and find stuff, and it's transparent. Gosh, how do you, as a company, get that same level of access? I mean, Sasha, you worked for a Fortune 10 firm, maybe even a Fortune 1 firm. They've got a lot of weight to throw around in terms of getting what they want from their software suppliers. But man, if you're just a middle of the bell curve type enterprise, you don't have that much leverage. So I guess how do you twist our arm in order to get the type of visibility that you need into what risks are out there in their applications and services?
Yeah, I think it's. Oh, go ahead, Sasha. I'll go after you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you nailed it, Paul, that the vast majority of the companies are unfortunately disadvantaged in being able to do much about this directly. Like, you can lob things over the fence at some of these, top 10 tech companies sort of all you want. And the degree to which they will listen, again, buyer side, is all dependent on how much revenue and how much you're actually kind of paying them, right? And you take your spot in the queue, let's say, that very reflective of your level of spend. But I think you also touched on something else that's very important, which is, we spend a lot of time talking about open source when it comes to software supply chain. Absolutely critical, absolutely a problem that I'm not trying to in any way understate the degree of concern. However, if you, and I just did a talk at a very large conference on this, and I polled a room of about 400 people, show of hands, how many of you picked an open source solution for your ERP versus, SAP or, Salesforce or something? And absolutely zero hands went up. Of course they didn't, and how many of you picked that for your unified communication and collaboration? Zero. And I went down the list of these corporate value chains or processes. How many of you use something open source for treasury management? Of course it's zero. Order to cash, hire to retire, any of the tools that are in these key corporate processes, zero people, zero hands, because of course they don't. These are expensive commercial packages made by very large vendors. And there's a reason they do that. They do that because that's someone who will then support it and who will, provide some level of attestation. However, if you look at, again, we'll list some of them: SolarWinds, 3CX, MoveIt, MeDocs through NotPetya, Kaseya, Circle CI, what you go down the list, every single one of these was a commercial package that was tampered with or had an implant or malware. So I think it's a very important point that, your commercial off-the-shelf program, whatever that looks like, your third-party risk management, whoever in your company manages the risk of the software you're buying and implementing from others, needs to have the same focus on, how do I know if I'm getting malware in this? How do I know if it's been tampered with? Just like the emphasis that you would put on open source. Sorry, Chris, you were going to say.
Oh, yeah, you're spot on. I was going to go down a similar route. Is like, despite all the emphasis and discussion we've had around open source software and the need to understand what we're consuming, who contributes to it, the vulnerabilities associated with it, when we look at things like the, CISA known exploited vulnerability list, it's not some obscure open source software library that's at the top of the list. It's the leading, technology firms that have the most exploited vulnerabilities. This year, right. It was, some open source software library that caused the ruckus. It was the Microsofts, the Oktas, the Progress Software MoveIt, for example, that impacted tens of millions of people and thousands of organizations. And just like, malicious actors realize that these large software providers and producers are, critical targets that have a massive, attack surface downstream across, millions of people using them. So they're targeting these entities, definitely. And as he talked about, this is where things like your third-party risk management program, having these attestations in place, asking for transparency from the provider is critical. But as he talked about, if you're an SMB, your level of transparency and what you can ask of a provider is going to look a lot different than if you're a U.S. government, for example. What you're going to get and what kind of transparency you're going to get is going to vary wildly.
Yeah, I mean, it's also important to realize that even just looking at things like CVEs is a really distorted view, because some companies like Microsoft are very good about reporting CVEs. They have tens of thousands, well, they have 10,000 of them to their name. Other companies choose not to participate in that program at all. They have zero. That doesn't mean they're secure. It just means that they're not disclosing what they find. And so from the consumer standpoint, you get this kind of funhouse mirror effect of like, whoa, look at all those vulnerabilities. It's like, well, that actually might be a more secure company because they're actually telling you what's going on. I don't know sometimes if people are aware of that. So Sasha, we're coming up on the top of the hour, but one thing that you raised just kind of when we were talking about this before we got online, was you really are seeing in the private insurance market some really interesting developments in terms of, so sometimes what the public sector can't easily do. CIS is asking you politely to do the right thing. Private insurers actually have a stick that they can wield, which is the cost of your coverage. What are you seeing from the insurance sector that you think might actually move the needle on application security and secure by design practices?
Yeah, it's really interesting. 7-8 years ago, I attended kind of this first inaugural hosted at Black Hat, this cyber insurance breakfast. And it was interesting at that time, a handful of us who were practitioners who kind of started it were discussing that not that long in the future. And it's interesting that it's materialized about like that. Not long in the future, companies will be less worried about PCI DSS, 4.0 or NIST, whatever, 3.5 or whatever is the latest thing. They'll be far more worried about, Travelers 4.1 and Allstate 3.4 and whatever these, cybersecurity standards are coming out of the insurance companies. And sure enough, it's kind of manifested that way, that early on, what they were asking for in the policies were not particularly good. And as a result, they had several years of higher payout rates. But now, they've put some unbelievable quants on this problem. They've done some incredible data science and analytics on this. And the latest characteristics of a security program that they're asking for are directly tied to what has led to breaches. So, I would actually say they went from some of the least informed people in the space to some of the best informed people in the space about what constitutes a good security program. So some of the things I've been talking to them about is, if we, again, I'm not going to relist them, but all of the breaches that have happened in the last 2-3 years seem to be somehow software supply chain related. They're now starting to include components of that and heavily weighted into the types of premiums that they offer their customers. So they're asking them, questions about like, talk to me about what you do, for the software you consume. How do you scrutinize it? And a lot of people's answers are things like, well, we have this questionnaire that we send, and the questionnaire is, 400 questions, and they answer it. And then we say it's high, medium, or low. And, and then we, throw, I don't know, Clam AV at it or something, because of course you can't SAST it and you can't DAST it and you can't do any of these things. And they say, okay, well, that's interesting. Those are questionnaires. So here's your increase in premium, and it's massive. And I say, whoa, what do I do with that? Well, what could I have done to, impact this? And the answer is, you could have done the things that we've just been describing. You could have insisted from your vendors that they ship you, secure by design and by default software. You could have put it through some sort of technical validation that, ensures that it doesn't have backdoors or tampering or malware. Or they ask you for things like for your own software that you produce, whether it's for commercial purposes or whether it's for internal use purposes. Even worse, if it's for commercial purposes, what are you doing to ensure that you are not, shipping malware or an implant or a breach to one of your customers? And so now it's starting to become this big component of the underwriters.
And Sasha, can companies actually look at these requirements and guidelines, or do you have to be a customer of the insurer?
So there are these companies that act as kind of brokers who will effectively work with you ahead of time to say, here is your kind of level of insurability, which think of it as basically like a security maturity score. And, they can work with you. Of course, it's generally for some kind of a fee, and then they help you shop for insurance. I mean, it is a business, but they are really, really good at telling you what are your likely premiums kind of going to be. So think of it like pre-qualifying for a loan. They work with you to find good rates, but at the same time, they work with you based on your security program. What are things you can do, to kind of make yourself more insurable or better insurable?
Okay. So we got one more question, and I think that's probably going to do it for us. This is, that guy Anonymous asked another question. Everyone knows you should update your enterprise applications, but how do I know these commercial off-the-shelf application updates are not malicious? Is there any legal liability for my company if we update our customers to infected commercial off-the-shelf software? Great question. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Yeah, I think Sasha touched on this a little bit earlier with, the fact that, we don't know if what we're pulling in is malicious, has been tampered, has malware inserted into it. And it's kind of such an unfortunate situation because, patching has been a longstanding best practice that we've advocated for so long. But what happens if the patch is poisonous or has been tampered with, right? And now you have a compromise as a result of that. So that's where I think getting to the activities we talked about, having secure software development practices and processes in place, attesting to those, doing things like signing of the software that you're pushing to downstream consumers. It doesn't automatically tell you that it's secure or safe, but it can give you some assurances around their secure software development practice, how they're producing software, how they're distributing it, the integrity of the software, things like that. And I'm curious Sasha's take too.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, if you look at what happened in MeDocs, right, that was an auto update. So, part of this is what are the practices for the software vendor for what it takes to contribute to their production build. How do developers authenticate to the kind of prod environment? Is there a jump box? Is it a different box? Is it MFA? Is it using their, domain credentials or a separate set of credentials? Is there a CAC card involved? So like it's beyond the software. It is, and this is what maybe some of those questionnaires would have asked in the past, at least the better ones that I've seen. Like the best ones that I've seen, those are exactly the questions they were asking. And they were asking them like 10 years ago. Where it was exactly about that. It was not so much the stuff you've shipped me, because at that point it's too late. It's already in my environment. I might not know. It's about what are all the practices that went into that piece of software being developed in the first place. And I don't mean just, SaaS tools and are you developing secure software, but who all has access to it? Who could have tampered with it? And I remember spending, countless days in the room with vendors. I would fly to them when I worked for, the large energy firm. I would fly to them and we would spend a long time at a whiteboard and they would go into incredible details over what just that one part of the process looked like. But that was a company with lots of resources and putting a tremendous amount of emphasis in security. You can't expect that level of, that's not scalable, and that's not a level of, expertise or scrutiny that most companies can put into the mass of their software environment. So I think a lot of that then comes down to kind of risk-based approaches. You probably have the stuff that's crown jewels, that's critical to your business. Maybe that's where you have those kinds of discussions. And for the rest of them, you take kind of more of a risk-based approach.
Okay. Do you guys have time for one more question?
Sure. For you, anytime.
Okay. It's a good one. That's why I'm asking it. Another question. What would the technical validation tools you spoke of be for things like backdoors and malware, et cetera? Really good question. Backdoors in an application, in a software update. How the heck am I supposed to define that?
Go ahead, Sasha. I think that one's directed at you.
Yeah. So I'll, this is probably going to come across very self-serving, but I'm not sure of another way to answer the question. Let me start it differently before I tell you. So what I see often out there is you have, companies say something like, we provide a comprehensive something, comprehensive SBOM, comprehensive scan, comprehensive whatever it is. One thing to think about is, unfortunately, the word comprehensive has more definitions than you would think. So I've talked to some companies who have said, we provide a comprehensive, whatever it is, SBOM. I said, okay. So if I gave you the Windows 11 ISO, I guess you could analyze that for me. Okay, so that's a good example of something so we can't do that. Like, why can't you do that? Well, that one's a little bit too big. We can't do anything over about 65 or 70 meg. Oh, okay. So comprehensive as long as it's less than 65 meg. Yes. Okay. And so what if I gave you, I don't know, zoom.exe? Another, that's tricky. So good one. That's tricky. So that's another one we can't do. Why is that? Well, so that one is commercial, and we only support open source. Okay, so comprehensive, as long as it's less than 65 meg and open source, right? Okay, but what if I gave you like this file with this file type? Oh man, you're really good at these trick questions. So, so we only support 7 file types, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, PDF, JPEG, and like 1 or 2 others. So that's not a file type we support, even though it's like completely common. So you're like, okay, so your version of comprehensive is as long as it's less than 65 meg, only open source, and one of these 7 file types, which represents exactly 0 of the apps that run my enterprise. So I would just say you need a tool that can do all of those things. And the only one that I'm aware of that can is ReversingLabs and a number of products, but there might be other ones out there. I'll just say I'm not aware of them. If they exist, I'm not aware of them. So if you're interested, reach out to ReversingLabs and we'd be happy to show you what their tools can do.
Really good note to end it on. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and there will be more of these to come. So follow us. And as we said, the recording for this is going to be sent out to you, and feel free to share it around with your contacts. But let me just take the final comment. Just, hey, Sasha, Chris, thank you so much for a really amazing discussion, and hope to have you both back in for a follow-up conversation. There's a lot more to be said about this.
Thank you.
And thanks for all those great questions. All right, take care, everyone.